Welcome back to the Vybrational Stage Podcast. Over the past week, we've been exploring a challenge that countless high-performing professionals experience, but very few can clearly describe. It begins as mental activity. Your mind keeps moving, planning, preparing, reviewing, anticipating, solving. Even after the workday is over, the meeting has ended, and the immediate crisis has been resolved, your mind continues operating as though it still is on the clock. On Monday, we explored why the mind always seems to be looking for the next thing. On Wednesday, we went a layer deeper and asked why so many successful people feel responsible for everything. Today, I want to bring those conversations together, because I don't believe the greatest burdens executives carry is their workload. I believe the greatest burden is something much more subtle. It is the inability to put the workload down, not physically, psychologically, emotionally, internally. Somewhere along the way, the responsibility stopped belonging to your calendar and started belonging to your identity. And once that happens, no amount of vacation time can solve that problem. Because wherever you go, your identity goes with you. Success changes more than just your calendar. One of the fascinating things about professional success is that it changes more than your schedule. It changes how people see you. As your influence grows, people begin relying on you, seeking your opinion, trusting your judgment, looking to you for answers. Initially, this feels incredibly rewarding. After all, isn't this what we've been working toward? To become someone whose contributions matter? Someone who can make a difference? Someone whose experience can create value? Absolutely. Healthy leadership creates tremendous value. Healthy responsibility creates tremendous value. Healthy influence creates tremendous value, but there's another process happening quietly beneath the surface. A process we rarely notice while it's occurring. As people increasingly depend upon us, we begin depending upon being depended upon. Read that again. As people increasingly depend upon us, we begin depending upon being depended upon. Without realizing it, being needed starts feeling necessary. Not necessarily for the organization, necessary for our identity. And this is where the relationship with responsibility begins to change. Responsibility stops being something we exercise, it becomes something we inhabit. The invisible promotion. Most promotions come with a title, a compensation adjustment, a new reporting structure. But there's another promotion that never appears in the employee handbook. It's the promotion from I have responsibilities to I am the responsible one. That sounds like a subtle distinction. It isn't. Because once you become the responsible one, your nervous system begins protecting that identity. You become the one who remembers, the one who anticipates, the one who catches mistakes before anyone else notices them, the one who carries conversations after everyone else has moved on, the one who mentally rehearses tomorrow before today has even ended. And because you have become very good at it, people reward you for it. They compliment your dedication, your reliability, your commitment, your work ethic, your leadership. But very few people stop to ask what it's costing you internally. Because outwardly you're succeeding. Inwardly, you may be quietly disappearing. When competence becomes a trap. There is something ironic about competence. The more competent you become, the more work tends to find you. The more decisions find you. The more responsibilities find you. Eventually, competence creates its own gravity. People naturally begin orbiting around the person who can solve problems. which sounds wonderful until you realize you've unintentionally become the organizational shock absorber. Problems don't disappear, they simply land on you, emotionally, mentally, strategically, operationally. You become the place where uncertainty goes. And because you've handled uncertainty well in the past, more uncertainty arrives. This creates a dangerous illusion. The illusion that because you can carry something, you should. But capability does not determine responsibility. Just because you possess the capacity to solve a problem doesn't automatically mean the problem belongs to you. This distinction is one of the most overlooked principles in leadership. The highest performing leaders are not the ones who carry the most. They're the ones who discern most clearly. They understand the difference between ownership, stewardship, delegation, support, and over-identification. Yet many professionals never develop this distinction. Instead, they slowly begin absorbing every problem that enters their awareness. Not because someone asked them to, because awareness itself begins feeling like ownership. If I know about it, then somehow it becomes mine. Have you ever noticed that? Sometimes merely becoming aware of a problem feels like accepting responsibility for solving it, and that's exhausting. The executive's unspoken fear. Let's go one layer deeper. There is an unspoken fear that many executives carry. Few admit it. Some never consciously recognize it. The fear isn't failure. Successful people know how to recover from failure. The fear isn't hard work. Successful people have demonstrated extraordinary resilience. The deeper fear sounds more like this. What happens if I stop carrying all of this? Who will notice? Who will step up? What if something falls apart? What if someone gets disappointed? What if my value has been tied to being the one who never lets anybody fall through the cracks? Notice what just happened. The question quietly shifted. It stopped being about the organization. It became about identity. Not what happens to the project, but what happens to me. And that is where the mind becomes trapped. Because the mind begins believing that constant vigilance is necessary, not merely for success, but for survival. The organization may not require your hypervigilance anymore, but your identity still does. Leadership or self-preservation. One of the most transformative questions I've ever encountered is this. Am I leading or am I protecting an identity? At first, this question can feel almost offensive. Of course I'm leading. Of course I'm serving. Of course I'm contributing. And all of this may be true, but there's another possibility worth considering. What if some portion of our relentless responsibility isn't actually leadership? What if it's self-preservation? What if constantly staying needed has quietly become the way we reassure ourselves that we matter? Because if that's true, then the inability to put things down isn't a productivity issue. It isn't a time management issue. It isn't a leadership issue. It's an identity issue. And identity cannot be solved with another planner, another productivity app, another organizational system. Because the problem isn't what's on your calendar. The problem is the meaning you've attached to what's on your calendar. And that's where we'll continue next time. Because there's a hidden bargain almost every high-performing professional makes with responsibility. And until we see that bargain clearly, we'll continue carrying far more than we were ever meant to carry. The hidden bargain. Before we ended the last segment, I suggested that many high-performing professionals make a bargain they never consciously realize they're making. It's not written down anywhere. Nobody teaches it. It simply develops over time. The bargain sounds something like this. If I become indispensable, I'll be secure. If I carry enough, I'll be valuable. If I solve enough problems, people will always need me. If I'm always available, I'll never become irrelevant. We rarely think these thoughts consciously. Instead, they quietly become the operating assumptions underneath our lives. And because they're unconscious, we never question them. We simply keep honoring the bargain. We work harder, carry more, stay later, answer one more email, take one more phone call, accept one more responsibility. Not because anyone is demanding it, because internally we've begun believing that our value is somehow connected to our usefulness. This is one of the greatest paradoxes of executive leadership. The very qualities that helped you become successful can quietly become the qualities that begin consuming you. Your commitment, your dependability, your initiative, your willingness to step in, your ability to solve problems, all extraordinary qualities until they become the only way you know how to experience yourself. The moving finish line. One of the things I've observed in high-performing professionals is that there is almost always another finish line. When you first entered your profession, perhaps the goal was simply to get hired. Then it became earning the promotion. Then it became the manager. Then it became the director. Then the executive. Then increasing revenue, growing the organization, building the business, preparing for retirement, achieving financial independence. The milestones continue changing. But have you ever noticed something? The internal pressure rarely changes because each accomplishment simply creates another expectation, another benchmark, another objective, another opportunity to prove yourself. Psychologists sometimes refer to this as hedonic adaptation, our tendency to quickly adapt to accomplishments so that what once felt extraordinary soon becomes normal. But I think something deeper is happening. We don't simply adapt to success. We begin depending on continual success to reassure ourselves that we still matter. The finish line keeps moving because the mind is trying to answer a question that achievement was never designed to answer. Am I enough? No promotion can answer that. No bonus can answer that. No title can answer that. No amount of responsibility can answer that. Because the question isn't professional. It's existential. Leadership versus ownership. This is where leadership often becomes distorted. Healthy leadership is about stewardship. Unhealthy leadership becomes ownership. Stewardship asks, what has been entrusted to me for this season? Ownership states, everything depends on me. Do you hear the difference? Stewardship understands that leadership is a temporary role. Ownership quietly transforms leadership into identity. Stewardship creates healthy boundaries. Ownership erases them. Stewardship allows delegation. Ownership resists it. Stewardship develops people. Ownership accumulates responsibility. One creates sustainable leadership. The other creates exhaustion. This is why some executives work fewer hours than others, yet experience dramatically less internal pressure. It's not because they care less. It's because they have learned something profound. They have learned that responsibility has boundaries. Identity doesn't. When responsibility becomes identity, every problem begins feeling personal. Every setback feels personal. Every criticism feels personal. Every disappointment feels personal. And that's an impossible way to lead. When awareness becomes ownership. Let's examine something incredibly subtle. Imagine someone on your team tells you about a potential issue. Nothing has gone wrong, it's simply a possibility. Almost instantly, your mind begins working, planning, forecasting, creating contingency plans, imagining conversations, considering outcomes. You haven't been assigned the problem, you're merely become aware of it, and yet awareness immediately transforms into ownership. How often does that happen? Someone mentions an issue at work. Now you're thinking about it during dinner. Someone shares a concern on Friday afternoon. Now it's occupying your mind all weekend. Your awareness has become a magnet. Everything it notices begins attaching itself to your identity. Eventually your mind becomes crowded, not because life is objectively overwhelming, but because nothing is allowed to simply pass through your awareness. Everything sticks, everything stays, everything becomes yours. No wonder the mind can't shut it off. It's become a warehouse of responsibilities. The cost of carrying everything. There's another cost we rarely acknowledge. Creativity begins disappearing. Curiosity begins disappearing. Presence begins disappearing. Not because we've lost those capacities, because they've been crowded out. The human mind has limited attention bandwidth. Every unnecessary responsibility consumes part of that bandwidth. Every imagined future, every hypothetical crisis, every unspoken expectation, every unresolved conversation, each one occupies cognitive resources. Eventually, we wake up one morning and realize we've become incredibly effective, but we've stopped feeling fully alive. Our calendar is full, our mind is full, our inbox is full, our responsibilities are full, yet internally something feels strangely empty. Not because we need more achievement, but because we've become so busy managing life, we've eventually stopped experiencing it. A different definition of leadership. Perhaps we've misunderstood leadership altogether. Perhaps leadership was never intended to mean carrying everything. Perhaps leadership is creating environments where responsibility is shared instead of accumulated. Perhaps leadership is knowing when to engage and when to let others grow. Perhaps leadership is trusting people enough to allow them to experience responsibility themselves. And perhaps the greatest act of leadership isn't carrying more. It's demonstrating that another way of living is possible. A way that values clarity over control, presence over pressure, discernment over accumulation, contribution over self-sacrifice. This doesn't make you less committed. It makes you more sustainable. Because organizations don't need leaders who can survive one difficult quarter. They need leaders who can remain psychologically healthy over decades. And that requires a completely different relationship with responsibility. Transition. So where does this leave us? If responsibility isn't meant to become identity, if leadership isn't measured by how much we carry, if success can never answer the question of our worth, then what actually remains? What is left when the pressure begins to soften? What is left when the responsibilities are no longer the source of our identity? That is where I want to take us in a final part of this conversation. Because I believe the answer to that question changes not only how we lead, but how we live. Beyond the role. As we conclude this week's conversation, I want to invite you into a different way of thinking about leadership. Actually, I want to invite you into a different way of experiencing yourself. Because if you've listened closely over this past week, you may have noticed that we haven't really been talking about leadership. We've been talking about identity. Leadership simply becomes the doorway. The real conversation has always been about relationship we develop with ourselves. Because somewhere along the way, many of us have stopped asking, what is my role? And began unconsciously asking, who do I need to become in order to deserve this role? At first, that distinction may seem insignificant. It isn't. One question is about function. The other is about identity. One is flexible. The other becomes imprisoning. And that's exactly what happens. Without realizing it, we begin constructing an internal version of ourselves. The dependable one, the strong one, the calm one, the capable one, the one who never lets anyone down, the one who always has the answers, the one who keeps everything moving. And after enough years, we stop playing the role, we become loyal to it. The identity we defend. Most people think they defend their position, or their reputation, or their career. I don't think that's actually true. I think what we defend most fiercely is our identity, because identity feels like survival. If my identity is the responsible one, then putting down responsibility feels dangerous. If my identity is the fixer, then allowing someone else to solve the problem feels threatening. If my identity is the dependable one, then saying no begins feeling like failure. Notice how quickly this happens. Nobody has to demand that you keep carrying everything. You begin demanding it of yourself, because the identity has become self-protective. It whispers, don't disappoint anyone. Don't drop the ball. Don't let anyone think you've changed. Keep proving yourself. And so the mind keeps running. Not because there is more work, because the identity believes there is more proving. The difference between responsibility and burden. This week I've reflected deeply on one question. What actually transforms responsibility into burden? Because responsibility by itself isn't the problem. Leadership isn't the problem. Commitment isn't the problem. Service isn't the problem. The burden becomes the moment responsibility becomes attachment to self-worth. The burden begins the moment our value depends upon how much we carry. Think about the difference. One leader says, this project has been entrusted to me. Another says, this project defines me. One creates stewardship. The other creates bondage. One allows healthy engagement. The other creates chronic vigilance. One allows completion. The other never feels finished. And perhaps that's why so many people feel exhausted despite accomplishing extraordinary things. They're not simply completing work. They're consciously maintaining an identity. That is a level of exhaustion that sleep alone can never repair. The leadership we rarely talk about. I want to suggest something that may challenge how many of us think about leadership. The highest form of leadership may not be carrying more. It may be creating enough trust that you no longer need to. Think about that. What if mature leadership isn't measured by how indispensable you become, but by how unnecessary your constant interventions become? What if your greatest contribution isn't solving every problem, but developing people who can solve problems themselves? What if real influence isn't creating dependence, but cultivating capability? This changes everything, because now leadership becomes an act of multiplication instead of accumulation. Instead of caring more, you begin growing more. Instead of controlling more, you begin trusting more. Instead of proving your value through constant involvement, you create environments where others begin discovering theirs. That is leadership. And remarkably, it requires caring less. What are you really carrying? Let's become even more honest. When you say, I'm carrying a lot right now, what are you actually carrying? Is it really the project? Or is it fear of disappointing people? Is it really the deadline? Or is it the pressure to prove yourself? Is it really the organization, or is it identity you've built inside the organization? Because those are very different burdens. One exists in reality, the other exists in interpretation. One requires action, the other requires awareness. And awareness changes everything. Because the moment you recognize that some of what you are carrying isn't actually responsibility, it's identity, a choice becomes possible. Perhaps I don't have to keep carrying this. Perhaps I still care deeply without carrying everything personally. Perhaps I can still lead powerfully without making leadership the source of my worth. The executive question. I'd like to leave you with a question. Not one to answer immediately, one to live with. One to return to over the coming days. The question is this. If I already knew my value could never be increased by achievement, how would I lead differently? Would you make different decisions, delegate differently, rest differently, trust differently? Would your conversations change? Would your priorities change? Would your relationships change? Would your evenings feel different? Would your weekends become available again? Would your mind finally have permission to become quiet? Not because there was nothing left to do, but because there was nothing left to prove. A different definition of success. Perhaps success isn't measured by how much you accomplish. Perhaps it isn't measured by how much responsibility you accumulate. Perhaps it isn't even measured by how many lives you influence. Perhaps success is measured by whether you can remain fully present while doing those things. Can you lead without losing yourself? Can you serve without sacrificing yourself? Can you care deeply without carrying everything? Can you remain committed without becoming consumed? I believe you can. But it requires seeing something most people never notice. That there is a profound difference between what you do and who you are. Closing reflection. This week we've explored a mind that never stops searching. We've explored a life that feels responsible for everything. And today we've discovered something even deeper. The greatest weight many high-performing professionals carry isn't their workload. It's the identity they've built around carrying it. And the beautiful news is this. What has been built can be released. Not by abandoning your responsibility, but by transforming your relationship with it. Because you were never meant to become the role. You were never meant to become the pressure. You were never meant to become the responsibility. Those are functions. They are not your identity. Beneath every role you've ever held, beneath every title, every success, every setback, every accomplishment, every expectation, there's something that has remained unchanged. The awareness that has witnessed your entire life. The quiet presence that existed before your first promotion and will remain long after your last one. Perhaps this is what you've been searching for all along. Not someone you must become, someone you're temporarily forgotten. And perhaps that is why putting the burden down feels so unfamiliar. Because for years you've believed the burden was helping you become someone, when in reality it has been covering up who you already are. Thank you for joining me on this week's journey. The 5-Shift Blog Invitation. If this week's conversation has resonated with you, the journey doesn't end here. In this week's 5-Shift Blog, we bring together the practical insights from the 5-Shift Podcast with the deeper awareness explored here on the Vybrational Stage Podcast. Together we'll explore how to redefine responsibility, reclaim clarity, and begin distinguishing between what is truly yours to carry and what never belonged on your shoulders in the first place. You'll also find our newest core problem exploration, VSP number 3, I Can't Shut It Off, now available as a guided deep dive experience for those who are ready to move beyond recognition into lasting transformation. And as the core problems explorations continue to grow, we're already preparing VSP number 4, where we'll explore another hidden pattern that quietly shapes the lives of high-performing professionals. Each exploration is designed to help you not simply understand the challenge, but to transform your relationship with it. Continue the conversation at the VibeShift blog. You can follow the link in the show notes. And when you're ready to go deeper, VSP number 3, I Can't Shut It Off, is also available. You can follow the link in the show notes. Until next time, may your leadership continue to inspire. May your contribution continue to matter. But above all, may you discover that your value has never been determined by how much you have been willing to carry. Sometimes the most courageous act of leadership is finally putting something down.